Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful. Hello, my name is Asia. It's Wednesday, September 24th, 2025, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. Today, we have with us human rights defender Audrey Aradanas and psychological scientist Darrin Hodgetts. Audrey Drey Aradanas is a passionate advocate for youth and families experiencing housing insecurity. She serves as the deputy director at Miami Homes for All, a nonprofit organization systems change related to affordable housing and homelessness. With a background in policy advocacy, coalition building, fundraising, and community engagement, Drey brings nearly a decade of experience in community development. A Filipina American, born in California, who spent her early childhood in the Caribbean, her diverse upbringing has shaped her commitment to building thriving and safe communities. She also serves on the boards of Florida Supportive Housing Coalition and the Florida Health Justice Project. She is a proud triple Florida International University graduate, earning her dual bachelor's degrees in 2016 and her master's in business administration in 2022. Welcome, Drey. Darrin Hodgetts is a professor of societal psychology at Massey University and coordinator of the EPIC, Enhancing Participation and Inclusive Change Collective. Prior to his present appointment, Darrin held positions in community medicine at Memorial University in Canada, societal psychology at the London School of Economic and Community Psychology at the University of Waikato, and Darrin's research examines the intersections of societal systems, urban precarity, human insecurities, and inequities in health. His book-length titles include Tackling Precarious Work Towards Sustainable Livelihoods, The Sage Handbook of Applied Social Psychology, Urban Poverty and Health Inequalities, a Relational Approach, and more. Darrin has been involved in the development of various services to meet the needs of people who happen to be homeless. Welcome, Darrin. It's wonderful to have you both with us. And as I usually do, I'm going to start with our human rights defender, Audrey, and ask you, how did you get involved in work on housing justice?
Thank you so much for having me here, Asia. So I got involved in housing justice due to my own background and history and my personal experiences growing up here in Miami-Dade. And growing up, I kind of felt the stark class differences almost immediately upon moving here. I just didn't know how or why, right? Miami, if you've ever been here, it's quite segregated after years of systemic racism and redlining. So I grew up in this neighborhood called Brickell. And when you go there now, it's very different. It's nightclubs and bars and fancy restaurants and tall buildings. But when I grew up there, it was pretty flat. There were beautiful limestones all throughout, small buildings everywhere, a predominantly thriving Latino neighborhood. The school I grew up in was kind of falling apart. All of a sudden, like fifth grade, next thing I know, there was a new skyscraper. And then slowly but surely, there were more and more buildings being built up. And all of a sudden, I saw my parents being quite stressed out because the rent just went up again, basically month to month. And at that point, growing up, we unfortunately had to choose whether we would have like wholesome meals with proper vegetables and all of that, or canned foods, or going to Wendy's down the street, rather than actually eating a proper meal because we needed to save money for rent. And I thought that was just normal because all of my friends were going through that growing up. We were all like, yeah, baked potato and chili. That's the normal meal. And so, luckily enough, my parents were able to afford, save up enough so that we were able to get out of that neighborhood and purchase a home. But it took a lot to do that, right? And seeing what the stress and the struggle that we went through, that kind of stuck with me. Coincidentally, that same street that I grew up on is now an affordable housing development. So it's quite interesting to kind of see how that all changed. And after graduating from college, I really was interested in social justice issues. And I came upon this organization called Miami Homes for All, which is the organization I work for. What I applied for was to address youth and family homelessness. And it was so fascinating to me as I did focus groups, meeting other youth and families. Their stories were so similar to my own. Many of them, were immigrants or came from a family of immigrants. And their first experience of housing instability was due to not being able to afford their residence. And then it just kind of had me realize that, housing justice overall is just this movement towards ensuring that all have access to safe and stable, affordable, dignified housing, and regardless of their income. So at the end of the day, as we all know in social justice movements, it's like housing is a human right. So that's what I'm working towards. And because I believe in that, that's why I got involved.
Thank you for sharing that, Audrey. I was going to ask you what housing justice means to you, but you kind of encapsulated some of it there, right? It's the commitment to housing being a human right and a movement towards ensuring people have, I believe you said, affordable and safe housing. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Tell me a little bit about what a day in the life looks like for you at Miami Homes for All.
A lot of fun. So I'm always learning something new every day. Probably not the level that Darrin and you go through, but there is quite a lot of research that I do in my day to day. So it's looking up what other communities are doing in policy or best practices and services and stuff like that. Looking at what other communities are doing or just researching what's happening locally in Miami-Dade County, whether that's through focus groups or through interviewing service providers, just really understanding the lay of the land in all aspects, right? And so through that, I'm working with my staff members. We're a team of 12 now. So I manage all of our programmatic staff. And from there, we meet together every day and we talk through what policy we want to see, what best practice do we want to see implemented. And we build coalition from there or implement programs or services from there and start advocating for those changes. So for example, one thing that we want to do, because here in Florida, a lot of tenant protections basically don't exist. These laws are being preempted at the state level. And so initially we had this tenant bill of rights, which basically got preempted at the state. And so now we're trying to figure out through research and coalition building, what are other avenues to have tenant protections? And what does that look like? And one thing that we have been developing is this affordable housing database. And so from there, we're kind of collecting information about landlords and units that exist in Miami-Dade County and making it tenant facing. So that way tenants can make informed decisions about where they will rent, right? Is this landlord flexible? Are they likely to push for an eviction? Are they, whatever. And so that's just an example of a task that we do daily.
Oh, I want that for everything. I want that for healthcare providers. I want that for schools. That's a fabulous database that you're building. Congratulations.
It's very exciting. And so, yeah, and right now it is open we're primarily working with homeless service providers, but as we're building this out, we do want this to be more open for all service providers and for tenants eventually.
Amazing. And Darrin, I want to ask you a little bit about what a day in the life looks like for you as a researcher. Tell us a little bit about what you study in plain language and what your day-to-day work is.
Well, thanks, Asia, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. And it's really lovely to meet you as well, Audrey, and to listen to your story, but also the fantastic work that you do. And I guess one of my roles is to document that stuff, to learn from it, and to teach generations of students about it. We have a big emphasis on research-based teaching, but also to be there in a kind of a supportive role. And we've been playing with the idea of community psychologists as scribes, where we have those research skills that you mentioned, and in some ways with the community partners, and we always work with community partners through services and so on, we become kind of the technician in the back room sometimes. Sometimes we become the group facilitator, and we really try and embed or, sort of enmesh ourselves within the organisation and just work constructively with where that organisation wants to go. And I think in some ways this goes against our scientific training, where we're kind of supposed to be the theorist and the intervener and the action person. And it's that realization over time that we're more of a supportive enabler. And that's really what my work tends to be. And if I'm in the field doing field work and so on, I'm really hanging out, getting involved. I remember when my friend Dame Diane and I were working together quite substantially at the Auckland City Mission. Often I would get a phone call and would say, the board wants to move the mission to a particular location. This will change access for clients to our services. Is there any evidence for what a disaster that might be? Because I think it will be. So I would spend my morning in Psych-Lit and everywhere else finding the information and writing a 2-pager that Diane could then go and talk to the board about. So that's an example of the type of work I do. And I guess in terms of the research side of things and the reports is really documenting human experience of these things. What's it like to be homeless? What's it like to navigate services and systems? And using that experience as a way of humanizing precarity and poverty and really bringing human beings back into sight and the dilemmas they're facing. Because I think it's much harder to be brutal to people when they're presented as a rounded human being to you, as opposed to a number on a graph or so on. So really, my days can vary quite a lot, but over time, our research practice has really kind of evolved into the scribe kind of role. And it feels comfortable and more genuine that way, and following the lead of the community organisations and just trying to bring science to bear on that. And so you were saying, Audrey, a lot of what you do is research-informed practices, how we would talk about it in my lingo. And really what I would see our role as is sharing the load of that documenting side of things.
That's beautiful. I love that framing. I think you're really onto something there, describing our roles as researchers, as scribes. We have a specific set of skills. We have a specific set of tools, and these can be useful for documentation and developing an evidence base, which, people in the community already know too well, right? But we're sort of amassing the evidence in a way that is clear and persuasive.
With that, Asia, there are conversations. It's that dual role between the service provider has a voice that has credibility in some spaces and the academic and the university does in other spaces. And when you combine that, I was thinking, a few years back, the Auckland City Council were looking at removing homeless people from the CBD and putting in a ban, and people go there for resourcing for services and so on. And we were asked through our community partners to present to the councillors who were making this decision. And what we did is, because we've been doing photo elicitation work and a lot of these kind of participative methods, we just simply put up simple questions like, where do you spend the night? Leave the question there, then an image of people making homes for themselves in public. How do you eat? How do you wash? These really simple things. But what we were trying to communicate is homeless people are doing the everyday things that all of us do. They just don't have access to a public space to do those things in. And so we ended up opening up a conversation about the use of the city and the CBD and what that might look like. And we managed to stave off this ban, because it was harder for the councillors to really ban people who simply didn't have an option. We ended up in a different conversation space, I guess is what I'm saying. And that became possible because us and our partners were playing slightly different roles in the same conversation. And I think we got the best of both worlds. Sorry, I just thought about that example while we were talking.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It has me thinking about spaces in which Audrey feels that she has authority as a human rights defender, and then the spaces in which she might find a scientist's voice helpful. Drey, tell us a little bit about the challenges that you have in your work and maybe where you could use a scientific voice.
I think kind of expanding on what Darrin was sharing earlier, it's that I think a big challenge that I see on the day to day is trying to change hearts and minds. I think it's no secret the US is going through a tumultuous time right now. Florida, even more so. I think there's a lot of issues with health, with school safety, with education, with housing, and there's like, it kind of feels like, I think as a nonprofit, it's kind of challenging to engage people because people are like, everything is on fire. So I need to focus on everything, or I need to only focus on one issue because everything is overwhelming. And to a certain point, that's kind of by design, right? It's on purpose to kind of force people into boxes or kind of force people to not get organized. So I think that's one really big challenge. And then the other is that unfortunately, a lot of people, and I think this is just, Darrin, you could probably talk more about this, but unfortunately, a lot of people still think that people are choosing to be poor or to experience poverty or experience homelessness. And it's not because of systemic failures. It's not because of, systemic racism or, structural decisions that our policymakers made many years ago. We're still seeing the impact of Reagan's economy to today, right? And we're still seeing the impact of others, right? And so I think that those are some big challenges that we try to address in the housing space, because our public housing issue is happening because of what happened back in the 80s, right? Due to federal policies, that the long-term impacts of them. And so I think where scientists can get really involved is really uplifting that research and telling that story, combining some of that, not only the numbers and statistics, but also the anecdotes behind them. If there's a way that, and there, I see this trend happening more and more of storytelling. I'm seeing universities getting more involved in terms of not only collecting, data and research, but also interviewing people from our past and kind of highlighting like, hey, this was the housing landscape. This is the environmental history of South Florida, and this is where we are now. And then also interviewing people these like, now contemporary, current, to kind of show that unfortunately history is kind of repeating itself. And I think that scientists and have powerful, even though right now they're it's kind of precarious here in the States and in Florida, but I think that there is something to be said about how important educators and scientists are in this arena, because for all intents and purposes, y'all have the gravitas. Here, grassroots worker, it's not the same as Dr. Hodgetts, Dr. Eden, right? PhD versus a scrappy kid who just graduated, who may or may not have went to school, right? And you also have that historical knowledge and just knowledge in general that I think that scientists can get so involved in kind of displaying that history, and also just like taking more of a stand in some of these like really tough social justice issues that, I think especially right now and in how things are going in our state, we need it more than ever, right? I mean, we have elected officials saying time and time again that vaccines are not helpful, that Tylenol is causing autism, all these things that are just simply not true. It's more important now than ever that people that are frankly, smarter. I mean, I'm just going to be honest, like, scientists, you spent years in school literally learning about this, whether that's in grad school or, medical school, all the schools. You probably spent more than 7 years at this point, probably, your PhD 12, I think, right? Like 12 plus years learning this and being educated on housing issues or health issues and whatever. And so frankly, y'all are smarter on some of these issues. You purposely sought out these positions. And so it's like, this is the opportune time. This is a time to showcase and educate folks, because unfortunately people are being swayed by false narratives, frankly, and just uninformed decisions.
I could just reply there. Look, I think we're very much on the same page. I think, looking at issues of choice, and we know people who come from impoverished backgrounds, and I mean that in a socioeconomic sense, because in a human sense, they can actually be quite enriching when people bond together and lots of loving families despite economic hardship. But I think that structural analysis is crucial. But for us, it's linking that structural analysis with the storytelling about how this manifests in people's lives and what it's like and how people respond to that. And just picking up on the point about who's smarter, I don't actually think we are smarter. I think we engage in a different form of knowledge. And if we go back to Aristotle, he had this idea of frenetic knowledge, and we talk about it as frenetic wisdom. someone like yourself that's engaging with this stuff, engaging with families, you hear the stories, you learn their knowledge, and frenetic knowledge is a practical wisdom. It's a understanding of how systems work and don't work. It's an understanding of the practical things that could be helpful. I've got a friend I affectionately refer to as Marxist Bill, and he's a sociologist, and he's the best demographic numbers guy you will ever meet. And when we're doing numbers stuff, Bill designs that and does that, and I do the qualitative side of it. But it really is about combining these forms of knowledge in a way that's helpful for the people that, and seeking that justice for the people who are suffering from systems that are fundamentally unfair. But it's also about, and I think the thing that you give us as intellectuals, Audrey, is a frenetic understanding, a practical wisdom about what's going to work, what's not going to work. I mean, we could cook up any sorts of ideas about how services should be and the rest of it, but it's less likely to work or be effective for families and for people experiencing homelessness and poverty. It's less likely to be effective if it's not combined with service provider and really detailed engagements with the families themselves. I think we get better, more humane and more just responses if we combine these forms of knowledge. And so a lot of our work, that's why we try and embed ourselves within agencies and services and build up, like we worked with the Auckland City Mission for 15 years. It started with a project on homelessness and it became programmatic in the sense that we went in with a project and an idea about research, and it was kind of driven by engaging with the theoretical literature, but it was also engaged with wanting to help. Over time, we were no longer setting the topics for research. After about 4 or 5 years, mission staff were saying, this is something we really need to know more about. This is something we need to look at. And for us as researchers and as applied intellectuals, it's kind of more comfortable working that way, and it just seemed more genuine and useful. So just going back to the main point, I don't think people are smarter than each other. I just think we have different pieces to the puzzle, I guess is what I would say.
I love that. I love all of the points, Audrey, that you made for scientists about being explicit in taking a stand when it comes to human rights, telling the story using all types of data, qualitative and quantitative, providing context and history, and using your gravitas, or, another word for that is privilege. Use that privilege that you get from having, initials behind your name. So, Darrin, let me ask you then, you've been doing this work for so long. What insights might science have to support the movement towards housing justice?
I think Audrey's hit on this as well, is it's a structural issue. It's not a personal deficit. And I think, in many ways, I look at our society, when I was growing up, homelessness was virtually non-existent. Now it's endemic, and it is a housing issue in some ways, but it's actually the housing side of it is a symptom of something much bigger. It's as we grow inequities in our society, how do you own someone else's home? Is something I've kind of struggled to get my head around. And when you own 10 rentals, you kind of deprive 10 families of owning their own home. And we have an economic model in my country and in yours that rewards that through tax incentives. It rewards that reproduction of privilege. It rewards that growing inequity. And until we address those issues, do we really need billionaires? Seriously. If we're not going to address those broader macroeconomic issues, picking up the pieces is incredibly important. It's important for people in distress. It's important for the humanity of our society. But while we're doing that, we've also got to look way further upstream. I was thinking about a project we did. We did a class analysis of 100 homeless people. And only 4 or 5 of them came from middle class or upper class backgrounds. So for most of them, ending up on, and I'm talking about street homelessness here, it wasn't a radical shift. It was, you'd sleep out at night, you're in trouble, you drift into this life world, you've grown up in an environment where you have the skills to survive in that place. And so what we wanted to do, and Diane and I cooked up with this idea, is to take a step back. So we've done a lot of work with homeless people. We cooked up this project called Family 100. So 10,000 people using the mission services. We selected the 1,000 that are the heaviest users. These are households of the food banks. And then we randomly selected 100 of those families, and then we followed them fortnightly for 18 months. And what we did in the design is rather than have grad students as interviewers, Diane allocated a day a week from the social work staff and we trained them as researchers. Part of the thinking was enhancing the knowledge production skills within the mission. And we found all sorts of really, really interesting things. So, for example, one household, kids were off school for 153 days in the year. Now, what we had done to reciprocate with the families for them talking to the social workers fortnightly, and then we would do recap interviews every 6 weeks for those interviews done over that period. So there are a number of big issues that were going on there. So kids were off school, and one of the things we had done is we removed food insecurity. So we gave them enhanced food packages every week. When households had access to reliable sources of food, kids were off school for 4 days. Now, if you think about the knock-on effects of that, just having food security meant kids had educational security in a sense. They were more engaged with education, they were more settled. And we know education is incredibly important, particularly in today's world, for social mobility, for getting a sustainable livelihood and things like this. So we started really appreciating, because we were looking at food, we were looking at services, we were looking at health, we were looking at housing all together. We started getting a kind of bigger picture of how these things interact. And then we started adjusting mission services live as we went. And we ended up running the crisis care team for 18 months, myself and a couple of colleagues. And it was a very big lesson for me about the fact that we have to adjust our theories and our methods if we're going to move into this practical space, and we have to do it in partnership. But we have to have those kind of voices in the conversation as well. And so by looking upstream, because these were the type of families that the majority of homeless people were coming from. And so by looking at the dynamics that were going on there and doing a structural analysis of why there was food insecurity, why children tended to go to school less, why these other things were happening. And we ended up working quite closely with the New Zealand Treasury, the Ministry of Social Development and so on about this project, because we had information nobody else had. And then because the Auckland City Missioner, who was a very socially justice orientated person, was driving it, and again, I think it's what we were talking about earlier is, who fronts at particular times with knowledge like this. So in many respects, talking directly with government, it was kind of a team act between Diane and I. So she was the service provider and the missioner had the practical expertise, and I was sitting behind her as the scientist. And I think it's an example of, again, that embedding yourself within organisations and community, and then letting research evolve over time with a practical orientation to it. So, yeah, I think in terms of lessons learned, I probably learned more from that project and those fortnightly engagements than anything I was ever taught in my degrees or I've read in an academic journal. Because it just became so real at that point. And also, one thing we did is, Diane had said, do you want to run short courses for staff to upskill them and so on? And we thought, well, that would create a weird dynamic between us as teachers and staff as learners. And in New Zealand, from Māori, our Indigenous population, there's a concept of tuakana teina, the older and the younger brother or sister. And the way in which a teacher learns from the student and the student learns from the teacher. But when we're looking at practical ways of responding to these families, we were learning as much, if not more, than what we were teaching. So rather than run a short course, what we did is created a reading group, and we would meet in a pub in the off week from engaging with the families, and we would just read relevant literature and discuss it. And we found that was a really good way of instilling a structural analysis in the social work staff, but also for us to understand the relevance of different research approaches and ideas to their everyday work. So I think a lot of this work is really about, we talk about relationships first, research second. If you build this trust and this relationship with the staff and with an agency like that, then it kind of just becomes a group of friends trying to do something useful rather than kind of academics and researchers and service providers. And that we almost became this kind of self-regulated work team where we could make things up as we went along. We could be flexible and responsive. And the enduring friendships that created, and with the families, there would be things like some of the single mums, which were about 32 or 33 of the households, would say the biggest issue for them was social isolation. Well, it made sense for the mission to host a coffee club, get a new coffee machine, let these women meet there, and just, it's not an intervention or a service, but it's just creating a space in which these women could then develop their own social network and support structures. Just this conversation's got me thinking about different projects and kind of reflecting on those a bit.
Yeah, and your point is well made that psychological scientists can help folks look upstream at the structural decisions that exacerbate inequality and housing insecurity. And we've talked about some of them. Redlining, Audrey mentioned, certain tax incentive structures, food deserts. But let me ask you now about what are some structural decisions that will lead us toward housing justice. And Audrey, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think Darren kind of mentioned it earlier. Do we really need billionaires? Right? And so I think that if we have this class of folks that are making so much income, they can afford additional taxes, right? And they should be paying their taxes, but that's another conversation. But I think for the most part, I think something that I would love to see in the future is reforms in how we invest in the infrastructure and housing in general, and homelessness, right? And so in Miami-Dade County in the late 80s and early 90s, there was some great innovation to invest in addressing inequities, right? And so we saw the formation of the food and beverage tax that anytime in Miami, whether you're a resident or a tourist, if you go to any establishment, restaurant or bar that serves alcohol, a penny of your bill goes directly into a fund to support folks experiencing homelessness, or fleeing domestic violence. For the 80s, that was a radical idea, right? Around that same time frame, just a few years later, we saw, a mass migration of of minors. And we also saw, there were a lot of riots going on in the late 90s, in the 90s, right, in Miami. And so to address that, the business community came together and they said, okay, we have this food and beverage tax, but we need to do something for our children and our families to prevent these various issues, right? Address health, address education, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, let's put a portion of our property taxes to go towards this fund called the Children's Trust. And it became a voter initiative, and people voted in support of doing this. They said, you know what, that makes sense. My home is valued over X amount. I will pay, I will be in support of a portion of my property taxes going to help youth and families in need. And thus the Children's Trust was created. And again, this was late 80s, early 90s, and maybe, yeah, and into the 90s, that again there was this need for innovation to invest in housing and services. And I think we're at a time where it's needed again. There are so many luxury homes in Miami-Dade County and South Florida in general that are frankly vacant. There are a lot of millionaires that are moving to Miami to buy their second home, third home, or whatever, their vacation home or a short-term rental that are vacant. And why not tax? Why can't we consider taxing or thinking of creating some sort of general obligation bond so that way there is a more robust fund. It could be a limited tax. That there's nuance, right? But at the end of the day, I think there needs to be a greater public investment and frankly, private as well. The private sector must get involved. That's how the first two iterations of great investment happened. The business community and the philanthropic community came together to do it. And I think it's time again for those kinds of policies. And I think that will have long-term impacts, ensuring housing justice, at least the needle is moved significantly. I think the other thing is again, like we need just greater engagement and education around tenant protections because they're lacking here in Miami-Dade County and in the state as well. Darren, you were mentioning earlier that it's interesting that, there are landlords out there that are essentially in charge of and lording over people's lives, whether that's a 10-unit building or a 1,000-unit building. So that's potentially 1,000 lives to 2,000 lives, depending on how many people are in each unit. And so it's a matter of how do we protect those renters and those tenants?
I actually agree with pretty much everything you've said. When you were talking about tax, we have an economist here, and he's not a radical left-wing economist or anything like that, but he came up with the phrase "tax is love."
I love that.
Right. And it goes against the very, we're told, oh, you can't tax your way to prosperity. We just have to look at US history. What happened to wealthy people coming out of the Great Depression? I think effective tax rates over some incomes were like 70%. You can correct me on that, but you can tax your way to prosperity. And the other thing, but it's how you use it and who do you use it for? And we know from Keynesian economics that if you put money at the bottom, it stimulates the economy and businesses thrive and all the rest of it. And I do think we need pots of money and we need to think creatively about that. We know alcohol can do a lot of harm. Some of the communities in New Zealand, you can't buy alcohol in the supermarkets that you can in other places. You have the outlets for selling alcohol, they're owned by a community trust, and all the profits go into that community trust. So my nephews and nieces in Mirihiku or Southland in English, which is basically the most southern region in New Zealand, when they were going to primary school, they had tablets and smart boards and all sorts of stuff. You've got lovely parks down there, you've got infrastructure, and it's all paid for by alcohol money. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't use a model like that, and you can do, the counselling around alcohol and drug and that kind of stuff. You can fund that, but you can also put pots of money like that into community housing providers and trusts where you build at cost, people rent or they rent to buy. There are ways of providing that housing security, but it requires collective action. And some people might call that communism, they might call it socialism. I mean, in many respects, it's common sense. The model we have now doesn't work. And so we really need to put our thinking caps on. And then I think about Holland and the Dutch, after World War II, it was flattened. And what they did is they put in public housing. A lot of people in Europe don't actually buy, but they've got, and you mentioned, Audrey, renters' rights. Okay, if we're going to have a rental-based housing economy, well, let's make sure that people have secure tenure, rent control, all of these things that enable them to stabilise. Because one of the things as a psychologist that really worries me is talking to friends who are primary school teachers, university friends, and they say one of the things that distresses them is children will come, they'll be in the classroom for 2 to 3 months and they'll go. And they'll move schools because the family has to move because of the rental instability. And what happens with those kids over time, they may see them a couple of years later, is if you're a child and you're forming friendships and attachments, if you're moving every 2 to 3 months, at some point you just stop doing that. And when kids don't form attachments, there's all sorts of very antisocial and negative things that can come from that. And again, it's not that the child is born a psychopath or a sociopath or a bad kid. It's that they've learnt over time that there's probably too much heartbreak in forming friendships and bonds with kids, and then your family has to move again. So that housing instability has knock-on effects for engagement with education, how people build social ties, how we commune with one another, that I think are devastating long term. And I think, many of our countries have to make a decision. I think we should have multiple housing provisions, and some should be, if people are going to rent, we should have, not-for-profit substantive housing and we can see this in a lot of European, particularly Northern European countries where these things have been operating for over 50 years and are incredibly social stabilizing kind of initiatives. So that's in the rental side of things. But on the other side of things, if people really want to own their own home, and lots of people still do, well, how do we enable that to happen? What are the things that we need to put in place to do that? And again, there are models from around the world that can be used to inform those kind of developments. The issue becomes that it probably needs to be done at scale. That's a complex thing, but hey, we should be up for challenges. Why not? Have a go.
I love that. I love the idea of, it's not working, so let's try something new, or let's try
Yeah.
something that other people are trying that's working, or that we've tried before that worked. Unfortunately, it has come to the time in the podcast where we've run out of time, but I want to give you each an opportunity to, have a last word, final say, anything that you want to articulate before we close.
Sure. So, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, I think there are great benefits in combining social justice defenders and scientists to move forward various agendas, whether that's for housing or homelessness, and other efforts in the health arena, education, etc. I think there's something really great that happens when we partner together. Whether it's a platform like this where we get to talk freely about what works and what we can do better, or even just making incredible strides in moving the work forward, because I think that's what's the most important part.
I'm just finding myself agreeing with you, Audrey, and I think the secret to this is teamwork. It's got to be about teamwork, and it's finding your accomplices, finding out who's good at what, and working with that. And I think, working to our collective strengths. And the other thing is, despite all that's going on in the world, universities are starting to talk about impact and are starting to think in quite sophisticated ways. And that doesn't mean how many times your article is cited by other people, because that's not impact, that's nonsense. What's really, really important is, can you make a contribution to practical efforts in the world? I guess one of the things that really got me involved in this work is when I started my academic job at the University of Waikato, they had a policy that we had a 40-40-20 split. So 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% service. Now that service could be, and these are important committees, library or staffing committee or that, but it could also be external to the university. So I ended up on boards of, the Christian Night Shelter Trust and these other things. And that was counted as part of my day job. And it was considered that as an academic, that day a week was for service. And I think, if the academy moves more in that direction, and some institutions are better than this than others, and embedding themselves in the community, there's a real resource there. There's a reason why these institutions exist. And I think for psychologists, we are an applied discipline, and sometimes we lose sight of that side of things. But that application, I think, works best when it's in partnership with the people who have put their careers into kind of helping other people such as yourself, Audrey. And I think when like-minded people come together, who employs you kind of becomes irrelevant. It's more about how do we work together constructively, and how do we leverage the resources of the different institutions to try and get some stuff done.
Thank you, Darrin. Thank you, Audrey. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. And yeah, I think it's a great example of public scholarship and diversifying our conception of what counts as impact. So thank you both for being on.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.